Well, hello. This being Canada Day, we have a great story for you, which I hope you'll enjoy. Um, it's a story about Canada and Montreal and the Parliament buildings, which were located in Montreal at the St. Anne's Market. So I'll tell you about that story and what happened, the initial findings, and what's been happening recently, which you may find very interesting. So hope you enjoy it. Happy Canada Day. In 1837, in 1838, there was an uprising in what was then Canada, which consisted of Lower Canada and Upper Canada. Louis-Joseph Papineau was the leader in Lower Canada, very well-liked man, very respected by the people of Quebec. And in Upper Canada, we had another man, William Lyon Mackenzie. Um, the uprising, which very indirectly by Mackenzie, but very directly by Monsieur Papineau, was to gain total political independence from the British Crown and to create the Republic of Canada. Well, as you can imagine, it didn't happen. The British responded in force, brutal force. And brutal force, I mean, men and women were hanged in public spots. Others were just executed on the spot. In the aftermath, women were rounded up and put on boats and shipped to one part of the world. Men were put on boats and shipped to another part of the world. Children were put on the boats and sent to a third part of the world. The feeling being that if they split up these folks, mostly Francophone, French Canadian, that they would not dare to rise against the British Crown again. Forgetting, of course, that there were a lot of Anglophones, a lot of English who were involved in this uprising, but penalties to them just didn't happen the way it happened to our Francophone brothers and sisters. So it was a brutal put down. And an interesting fact for you to know is that those British soldiers came from what is now Cornwall, Lancaster, Ontario. And I can't remember the name of the battalion, but the battalion still exists today. So another interesting bit for you. So the British responded after the rebellion by creating what they called the province of Canada. And the province of Canada would have its own parliament, and the province of Canada will be divided into Canada East and Canada West. Canada East being what is now Quebec, Canada West being what is now Ontario. And, so the parliament was established. Now, up until 1844, the capital of this British colony called Canada was Kingston, Ontario. Well, Lord Bagot was brought on board to be the Governor General, and he decided that Kingston was just too close to the US-Canada border. And he was afraid that being that close, it could be easily overrun by invading American soldiers. And he felt that if he moved the Parliament buildings to Montreal, he would appease the separatists, the independence feeling in Quebec, as they would see that they were being included in the Canadian experiment, if you wish, and feel good about it. Ulterior motive was that they would see the beauty and the benefit of the British way and give up their Catholic faith and their French language and become British. Well, as you know and I know, that didn't happen. Thank God. In 1845, the Parliament passed what is called the Rebellion Losses Act. And this was a bill to compensate people who had suffered as a result of and directly from the uprisings of 1837 and 1838. So the bill was passed. In its application, though, the benefits were allocated strictly to English people, those who were of English birth, birthright, language, and all the rest of this good stuff. The Francophones were not provided any compensation, even though their farms, their barns were burned to the ground, their crops were burned out, everything that they owned was destroyed. They had nowhere to live. Um, that first winter after the rebellion was a pretty tough winter with a lot of these people living with no home. But the Francophone, did not receive any compensation, forgetting the fact that Mackenzie had led a whole lot of Anglophones, English-speaking people, in this uprising. But the British elite decided that it was strictly a Francophone uprising and they should pay the price. And so they were not compensated. So it wasn't very fair. In 1848, an interesting thing happened. Up until 1848, while we had a parliament in what was then Canada, it was controlled by the majority English, mostly English loyal to the British Crown. And these English made sure that laws were passed that gave prominence to the British Crown and the English language and the English culture and the Protestant religion. And this was fact. This went on. Well, in 1848, a weird and strange thing happened. The Francophone got out and voted. And enough of them got out and voted that they voted in a Francophone parliament. Well, you can imagine how this went over. Lord Elgin, who had been appointed Governor General by the British Queen, had said that no matter what, he would abide by the wishes of the Canadian Parliament. And here we see the beginning of the independence of the Canadian Parliament from their British overlords in London, England. And he stood by that. So the election showed a majority government of Francophones. And he supported that. And he said, if this is the wish of the people, so be it. Well, you can bet the Anglophones, the Tories, were furious. For the first time in their life and their history in Canada, they had lost control. They had lost majority control. They were furious. So while they lost control of the Parliament, they did not lose control of the British Army. And these Tories started to have private meetings where they did not include any Francophones. But the Parliament had been won, and Parliament was put together at that time in 1848 by a majority of Francophone members, elected members, and Parliament resumed. So things went on. They did their daily business, and they passed laws, taxation laws, laws related to land ownership, boundaries, and this sort of thing. On April 29th, 1849, introduced into the Canadian Parliament in Montreal was a new Rebellion Losses Act. Now, this act was almost identical to the original one, but it included direct compensation to the Francophone population. Well, the Tories were furious. The Anglophone, loyal to England, were furious at French people who they said mounted an uprising and supported an independent Canada should be compensated, forgetting, of course, that there were a lot of Anglophones involved with this uprising. They were not happy. So on the day that the bill was passed, Lord Elgin signed the bill into law, promptly left the Parliament buildings, got into his carriage, and rode off into the night. As his carriage left the Parliament buildings in St. Anne's Market, he was pelted with stones and cow manure, sheep manure, but he kept going. Nobody really stopped him. Once he was out of Montreal and back on his estate, the British Army surrounded him and protected him. Meanwhile, back at the Parliament buildings, the Speaker of the House was conducting business as is normal, and for some reason, Lord Elgin, who was responsible for security of the Parliament buildings, had only left 2 unarmed guards at the doors of the Parliament buildings. And the doors were left wide open. All the windows of the Parliament building were opened, wide open. Total access to the buildings. Well, a mob developed. And the parliamentarians sitting in the building could hear the mob outside. And what was all this commotion? A man burst into the parliament buildings and boldly screamed out, "I declare this parliament closed." And he picked up the royal mace and he threw it on the ground and shattered it. At the same time, other demonstrators opened up the pipelines providing gas to the building for heat and lighting and set it on fire. Other demonstrators threw torches through the open windows, which set the curtains on fire. And so the fire began, and the building at the aftermath burned to the ground. What was lost in that fire was approximately 23,000 volumes of books on Canadian history and the people in Canada at that time. Government archives. It was terrible, terrible fire. The building burned to the ground. There was an inquiry afterwards, because remember, the riot went on for a couple of days. There was an inquiry, and it was found that the rioters were Francophone people upset with Parliament, and that they were to blame. And eventually, the Queen of England, I think it was Victoria, moved the Parliament buildings to Ottawa. And this was after a period of time when the Parliament buildings rotated between Quebec City and Toronto. But the British Queen decided they should be in Ottawa, and so the current Parliament buildings were built in Ottawa, and so be it. The aftermath. This is interesting. The aftermath of the fire. A couple of things have been discovered. Number one, based on history, written history from the Grey Nuns who had their major nunnery home across the street from the Parliament buildings, have detailed, in direct detail, quotes, that the people involved with the uprising were not Francophone. They were English, many of them English soldiers who the nuns had witnessed taking off their uniforms and putting on clothing to resemble the Francophone, speaking perfect English, but during the rebellion, during the actual attack on the riot on the Parliament building, spoke French. Well documented by the Grey Nuns. So thank you for the Grey Nuns. I mentioned to you all of the books that were destroyed. Terrible, terrible stuff. Nobody was ever convicted for this uprising. Now, here's an interesting bit. In 2017, there was some work going on in Montreal in the old, St. Anne's Market District. And guess what they found? They found the original floor floor supports of the Parliament buildings. They found volumes of books which had been charred, some not burned completely. Other things that they found, the original stamp of the Parliament of Canada. There were 2 stamps found of the original Parliament in perfect order. They found half-eaten cans of food. They found pipes. They found notebooks. It was just a treasure trove of artifacts from that fire. And so it has been declared by the federal government and the Quebec government to be a National Historic Site. And slowly, to this day, people are slowly going through all the remaining debris of these Parliament buildings, which spread over 106 acres, and finding so much about our early history, and working on retrieving the semi-burned books and notes from various parliamentarians at the time. So, while we study history, it is always good to remember what are the true facts behind the story. When I learned about Canadian history, I learned about how the French had burned the Parliament buildings in Montreal to the ground in an uprising against the British Crown, when in fact this did not happen. So I hope you enjoyed this story about our early Canadian history, and take care. Again, happy Canada.